Hello. We all know there are many traders in India who does regular export business to USA and Canada market, but maybe due to lack of information in terms of regulations, policies etc. documents which needed along with consignments may not be there when shipments arrives USA or Canada as required by authorities. So often we get into trouble, and at times, shipments reaches in USA or Canada get rejected, and we might have to face heavy loss. To avoid any further loss, we must update ourselves with latest rules and regulations, and when we plan to export either seafood or spices products to USA and Canada. In this video you will get trained or educated by experts, who took initiative to reach you with latest rules and regulations, and what all documentations required etc. And also why these products are getting rejected and returned to India by both USA and Canada authorities. This video will truly educate you in terms of making your documentation current before you export shipments to USA or Canada. The Atchison Group confirmed to support you with what all documentation required and must comply with before you plan to export from India. We do hope this video will bring you more knowledge on documentation and test reports etc., so that you can make all documents current before you export to USA and Canada and avoid heavy loss.
First off, Health Canada it sets the standards for food in Canada, and they administer what's known as the Food and Drugs Act. So this is an act that has been around for a long time. It goes back to the 1920s, but it has been modernized a number of times in recent years. Health Canada is not the inspection part of the food regulatory program in Canada. They set standards, they have laboratories, and they are mainly policy around food in general. And they work very, very closely with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which is my background, is really the operational delivery arm for all the inspection programs for Canada. It not only covers food inspection, but it also covers animal and plant health. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency brought all these programs together under one roof in 1997 and has evolved since then to be quite a large part of the Government of Canada's regulatory operations. They do food inspections, they manage food recalls, they have a number of laboratories do testing, they do the enforcement of the laws around food. Very important function that sometimes is overlooked is the export certification. So many countries, including India, require export certificates, and these are issued for each shipment when requested to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and there are very elaborate programs around that to ensure that the products that are exported from Canada meet foreign country standards. There's also facility licensing, penalties, etc. Can we just finish that slide? Yeah. I do want to mention quickly the Public Health Agency of Canada. This is a very similar organization to what you hear of in the United States, which is the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control. This is mainly a medical organization in the sense that they oversee health policy, and they also, whenever there's a foodborne illness outbreak in Canada, it is investigated by the Public Health Agency of Canada. So next, please. Okay, the main piece of food legislation, besides the Food and Drugs Act under Health Canada, is the Safe Food for Canadians Act. It was passed back in 2012, but it really didn't come into effect until relatively recently in 2019. This was driven in Canada by some very major food safety incidents. We had a number of outbreaks, a number of deaths associated with Listeria in processed meats, E-coli in beef, and this led the government to act very affirmatively to adjust that situation and make sure that all food from Canada and for Canadians is safe. So this act replaced a number of previous federal acts before. There was a Fish Inspection Act, the Meat Inspection Act, etc. Brought it all in under one roof and consolidated it into 14 sets of regulations. And it brings in new elements which are very parallel to the United States. So you'll hear about preventive controls, which are mandatory measures that must be taken to protect food. Licensing, essentially all operations, importing, exporting, processing, manufacturing, need to be licensed now, and that was not the case before. And there are new provisions for traceability to ensure that all foods can be traced. Next, please. So here's some highlights of the Safe Food for Canadians Act and the associated regulations. It's very much a modern piece of legislation in the sense that it is risk-based, and you hear the term outcome-based. And what we mean by that is that the rules are not as prescriptive as they once were. In other words, if an industry can demonstrate that they can produce safe food, the very prescriptive types of regulations, like the ceilings in a plant have to be so many meters high and have to be painted white, and the floor has to be sloped at such a certain angle. Those kind of things are out the window, really. They're far too prescriptive, and it's about outcomes and making sure that food is safe. So some people struggle with that because it does open up the playing field a little bit, but it is an important advancement. There's added prohibitions against food tampering and deceptive practices, which we all know that food fraud and food tampering are increasingly a concern in the food industry. Strengthening food traceability, improving import controls, because so much food in North America is imported that it was definitely needed to have stronger import controls. Aligning inspection and enforcement powers so that seafood, meat, eggs, all products are treated the same in terms of enforcement. Ability to certify foods for export. And there is now a review mechanism. So if somebody is not, doesn't agree with a decision by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, there is a way to appeal that. And they're also brought in stronger fines and penalties. Next, please. Just want to mention that, again, this licensing part is really, really important. So all companies, as I indicated, that trade food in Canada, export, import, etc., have to be licensed. And this replaces the old system of like meat plant or fish plant registrations. It's now a consistent license across all foods. Companies have to apply for a license. They have to identify products. They have to demonstrate that they have a preventive controls program. It lasts for 2 years. I do want to mention that there are, in the United States, agreement with the United States so that U.S. companies can hold a Canadian Safe Food for Canadians license. For those exporting from India, it's best to connect with a Canadian importer who will then hold the license to import your product. And just to say that these licenses can be suspended or canceled. Sorry. Okay, so the impact on importers, it goes without saying that all imported foods must be compliant with Canadian regulations. You have to have an importer preventive control program. So this is a food safety system that's written down, keeps records, checks products, looks at the foreign supplier. All those kinds of things are important parts of an importer preventive control program. And CFIA will audit those programs. And they've done a lot of that in recent years. The importer is the responsible party for ensuring that food is safe. So it all depends on the importer. It's their responsibility. That is who CFIA will be working with. And as I said, CFIA audits these importers to ensure programs in place. And in the last year, we've had a number of clients who have come to us that were seeking assistance with when a CFIA found some issues with their import control program. Next, please. So just a couple of other new things for CFIA and in Canada, things that exporters in India and importers need to think about. There is a new Listeria policy issued by Health Canada. It is a little, it was really needed to be updated because it had been about almost 15 years since it had come in. And it applies to all ready-to-eat products. So cooked shrimp is a really good example of where this policy applied. And that's, of course, a major commodity for export to Canada from India. The definition of ready-to-eat foods, RTE, has changed. And it is a much more user-friendly policy that if you're in that business, it's very wise to become familiar with that. And so that is something new that comes into effect October 1st, so very, very soon. So good to be aware of that. Canada's a little bit different from the United States in terms of Listeria policy. We do allow in Canada up to 100 colony-forming units. It's a tolerance for Listeria monocytogenes, whereas the U.S. has a zero tolerance. Next, please. Okay, so the top 3 food safety violations are undeclared allergens, pathogens, Salmonella, E-coli, Listeria, foreign material, extraneous matter. Ranjit, at this point, are you going to do some of these slides?
I can take this one, this next one, Cam, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So CFIA do not actually publish the public data that as FDA do. So the best way to find out the top violations and where the product is affected and it is resulting into recall is the CFIA food recall data. So we have getting some study done on that, and we found that 42% of the total recalls of year to date is allergens related, undeclared allergens. 34% are mostly on the biological hazards, which is the bacteria, harmful bacteria pathogen found in the product, which was deemed to be unsafe or made somebody sick or could potentially be made somebody sick if consumed. The 10% is a foreign material and 10% quality spoilage and 4% of the chemical and labeling violations, which we will hear similar data with the when next slides that will come for the US regulations. And then we will conclude that between US and Canada, the problem is almost the same. And and that is more, this data shows only what CFIA issued as recalls within country, but there could be, the reason could be somewhat of some of the import products will be maybe there. So with this slide, we will move on to request Dr. David Atchison to take on for the US part of the regulatory updates for the next slide. David?
No, thank you. My approach is very similar to what you heard from my colleague Cameron Prince. And there's a lot of similarities between the United States and the Canadian approach to food safety. This initial slide just simply shows the structure within the United States of the way food safety is regulated. Essentially, it's regulated either under the Department of Agriculture, if it's a meat, poultry, or egg product, and that's effectuated through the Food Safety Inspection Service through a continuous inspection process, or it's under the Department of Health and Human Services. Those are 2 big cabinet-level departments, and under Health and Human Services, that's where you find the Food and Drug Administration that regulates many things, including all the remaining food that's not under USDA, and also the Centers for Disease Control, which is really our public health arm. So the importance of just showing you this is that if it's meat and poultry and egg products versus everything else, the statutory authorities, the laws behind food regulations are actually very different. And that results in different levels of regulatory requirements. And going back to my opening comments, is understanding what those regulatory requirements are is critical to be able to manage them. So let's go to the next slide. So as we sort of move into regulatory impacts on importers, as you heard from my colleague Cameron, the Canadians put in place a risk-based preventive control program. The United States did exactly the same thing, called the Food Safety Modernization Act. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the Food Safety Modernization Act. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. But this was the biggest change to US regulations in 75 years. It applies to almost every food facility producing food. Now, seafood is just a little different. Seafood already had a lot of rules. They are very specific to seafood. The principles are no different, but the details are different. And if you're importing seafood, it is important to understand that seafood is a little bit different. But again, it's based on where are the risks and how are you controlling them. And those are two of the very key components. So let's go to the next slide as we look a bit more in detail about the Food Safety Modernization Act. Can we go to the next slide? We could spend all day talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act. It is an extremely complicated process, but the principles are important to understand, and it really begins by understanding your hazards. Top of this slide, you can see essentially where we begin is like, what are the risks that we're trying to control? Same principle, whether it's a seafood issue or it's a non-seafood issue, it's spices or whatever it may be. Once you've identified those hazards, what are the controls you need to control the risks? Then there's monitoring steps around, are those risks being controlled? You need corrective actions when there are when the risks are not being controlled. You have to verify that the program is working, and there is an ongoing period of reanalysis. All this has to be collected in a food safety plan. I've summarized this in 30 seconds, but the reality is that this is hundreds of pages of regulatory requirements, and it is very detailed and very specific. And if you are exporting food to the US, the government in the United States will expect you to understand this and be compliant with it. And if you are not, then they likely will not allow you to import the food. It sounds simple, but it is complex. And as I said in my opening remarks, a big part of managing the risk is simply understanding what you need to do. And we can do a lot to help you do that. So let's move along here to the next slide as we talk about some of the changes. So the Food Safety Modernization Act was put in place in 2011. And it was a little bit ahead of the rules in Canada. Companies had to be compliant with the Food Safety Modernization Act beginning in 2016. But the rules continue to change. And one of the most important changes that you all need to be aware of is that the FDA is now putting in comprehensive new requirements for traceability for certain FDA-regulated products. And the ones that this applies to are the high-risk products. We don't have time to go into a list of those, but certainly we'd be happy to engage with you in terms of what those are. This is a complicated rule. It was put in place or is being put in place right now. Companies have to be compliant with this rule by 2026, so there's a little time to get it right, but it is complex. And we have programs here at TAG to help you understand whether you need to be compliant with this, how you should be compliant with this, and what are the requirements. So this is one of the biggest changes that we need to pay attention to right now. And now's the time to be looking at the traceability rules so that you're ready for it in a couple of years. Let's go to the next slide. So as we look at, much like you heard from Canada, where are the hazards? What are we seeing in the United States that are causing problems? Well, there's a big focus in the US on chemical risks. Pesticides, drug residues, allergens, all of those are a very large focus in the US. Physical hazards, foreign materials, Again, big problem, plastic, metal, stones, and then biological hazards, which obviously have been around for a long time. But salmonella in seafood specifically, and in spices, both of which are very, very important products coming out of India, are a big focus for the Food and Drug Administration. FDA regulates both seafood and spices and pay a lot of attention to the risks associated with those. So let's go to the next slide as we sort of get into, well, where are we seeing problems? Examples of refusals. And the US government has programs where every single entity every single food item that is into the US, one has to seek permission, prior notice to submit it, and there is an active acceptance of that product. Many get refused for a variety of reasons. And some of the common reasons here, we've got salmonella in sesame seeds. Right now, that is a big focus. We've got pesticides in mangoes. We've got salmonella and filth in shrimp. We've got misbranding and salmonella in spices. We've got filth and salmonella in black pepper. And we've got filth in tamarind. So we could go on again all day with this list. There's a lot of examples. But here you can kind of sense that it's fresh produce, it's spices, it's seafood, where the risks are and where the regulatory focus is. Let's go to the next slide. So as we move more into what are we seeing from India, what are the reasons for import refusals? Adulteration and misbranding are the two big areas. So under adulteration, we've got a variety of challenges. Insanitary conditions, salmonella, pesticides, unsafe use of colors and additives. Under the misbranding, which is the label has to be right. So is the ingredient list reflecting what's in the product? Sometimes it's not. That's a problem. Are there allergens properly called out? Are there color dyes that are not approved for use in the US? And again, it's all part of understanding. So what are the labeling requirements? What are the dyes that are allowed? What are the pesticides that are allowed? And it's a very specific list. And helping companies stay out of trouble is the more you understand about what those regulations are and what the lists are and what's allowed, that can keep you out of trouble with the regulatory agencies. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the data. Here in the United States, we do capture information about what is refused. And we just looked back at May, June, and July for 2023 to see, well, what has been refused from India by the US Food and Drug Administration. And without going into a lot of details here, these data are captured on this slide, and you can see here, this is the absolute number of refusals. So there's been 62 refusals for filth, 25 for lack of processing details, 32 for salmonella, 70 for pesticides, and so on. You can see there's a fairly high number of refusals across a variety of different categories. And this is cumulative for just 3 months. This is just 3 months of refusals. Let's go to the next slide. When we look at misbranding, color labeling there, we've got 13 of those. We've got nutrition labels problems, we've got 11. The ingredient list, we've got 11. And again, it sort of shows you there's a wide range of refusals around just failure to have the label right. And if the label isn't correct, then the product is refused entry. Yeah, go to the next slide. Okay, so here we look at more details on a month-over-month basis. So if we look here in May, the commonest cause of refusals was pesticides. Similarly, in June, the commonest cause of refusal was pesticides. When we look at July, the commonest cause of refusals was filth. So the combination of these four, where there's failure to properly control the risks through processing, salmonella findings, pesticide findings, and filth, which is really what filth means, is that it's produced in an environment that the FDA does not believe is safe. And that can be based on a number of criteria. So these are all preventable. These are all things that can be done to prevent a problem. And if there is a problem, then what the FDA will do is to refuse entry of the product if they discover it. Worse than that is that they put, from time to time, they put Indian companies and others onto something called an import alert. And I know Ranjit is going to say a little bit more about the implications of an import alert in just one minute. So that's essentially a quick snapshot of what we see. Let's go to the next slide. I think, is there a little bit more here to say on imported foods. As you're well aware, there's a lot of food gets imported into the United States. The FDA does not inspect all of it. They only inspect about 2 to 5%. Not much is tested. For the USDA, remember that's meat and poultry and egg products, the USDA inspects 100% of the food. FDA does not do that. Why don't FDA do that? Because so much product, the volumes are so much greater, and the FDA does not have the resources. So they inspect based on risk. And those last several slides that I've shown you with Salmonella, with labeling, with colors, with filth, focus on seafood, focus on spices, focus on high-risk foods. That's where FDA goes. They know where the problems are likely to be found, and that's where they go. So it may be only 2 to 5% of total imported foods, but it's a much higher percentage of seafood and spices and other foods that could be a problem. As I've said, food will get refused, and if there's a real problem, for example, Salmonella is found, then there's a high probability that the company trying to export the food will be put on an import alert. Next slide, please. So we're going to move into violations and a bit more on import alerts, and I'm going to let Ranjit take this through to the end. So over to you, Ranjit.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Cam. This was a really great connection of like what's going on in CFIA world, what is going on in FDA world, as well as how those respective changes are affecting the importers. So just to continue from here, the import violations, what are the possible reasons as we are emphasizing on food safety plan? It's very commonly known with terminology about hazard analysis, critical control points, verifications, and corrective actions, and the whole circle of food safety plan is very well known. But is it effective? So majority of the import issues are coming from due to lack of ineffective food safety plan. We cannot copy and paste factory A to factory B a food safety plan. It has to be written for the purpose of use of that facility, the raw material procurement, the testing methods, the risks, local risks, the risks from coming from the supply chain, risk going into the processing. So what we have found based on our interaction with our client partners in India is that everybody knows food safety plan, but is it effective? If the standards, sanitation standards are effective and validation processes are actually making the sense to address the risk. Salmonella issue comes because of ineffective environmental monitoring program. They do test 500 swabs in a month for Salmonella, but there's still FDA found Salmonella in the product. Where is that coming from? Lack of proper competency in doing a proper root cause analysis and corrective actions. We can talk all about where is things missing. FDA and CFIA are more looking for effective, proven validation system rather than a very nicely written food safety plan. And it is coming with the training and education and promotion of compliance by looking into preventive control of CFIA, preventive control of FDA, in the preventive control rule of FSMA, and coming together with a specific to facility, specific to product, specific to process food safety plan. And that is one very, it is doable, but it's really seen as a mostly written in a way that it is not effective enough to control the risk. So FDA and CFIA do not find any violated product in your imported products here. Consequences, soon we get into the issue that product is found violated due to any reason. It can lead into warning letters, product detentions, product seizure, and having a subject to testing, mandatory recall, suspension of license of US and Canada, and it can further go to the criminal investigation. So most of the data we have seen we always follow data, but we have, for the purpose of this session, we have made data from May, June, July, and we can see those listed 70 containers in 3 months for pesticide, 20 plus containers for Salmonella issue. What is that telling us? It's more like it's a lot of violation going on due to some ineffective programs in place, so we couldn't catch in India, and somebody caught the problem here, and it went into the legal action by the legislature and regulatory bodies of Canada and US. And detention without physical exam lead into further interruption to your business, and you will have a test and hold of every shipment. I was working with one of the laboratory who do FDA testing, and it is between $3,000 to $5,000 per container testing based on the sampling, and the operator is at the verge of a positive result, has to bear a cost of per square footage of the storage in the warehouse. So the cost of handling a detained product and further working with the government regulators in US and Canada is pretty high for Indian or any exporters to India, any importers to Canada and US. So it's very important to try to best to do a best program on the ground, so we don't get into this situation. Now, I want to move quickly on the very high level, the customer requirements. So the main focus of the being in the bringing the product to US is to getting into the largest customer retailers. So the largest retailers have additional requirements on top of what is required on the government level. So we have also followed the largest retailers who are prominent in Canada and US, and one of the retailer came up with very specific requirements of foreign material control device. Because foreign material is the biggest concern in the end user. This is a disappointment for end user when they found the metal, the plastic, the fiber, some kind of nuts or bolts or something that is not properly, cannot be found, cannot be prevented to come into product. So this retailer has come up with a mandatory requirement that you need to have an X-ray detection device for finished product. Now, this has led into several changes in the supply chain, but at the same time, we have to understand how can this requirement can be met. And they also wanted a proper rejection device. Like if the product is tested, how to ensure the rejected product is not coming back on the good product pile. So there are several requirements we want to make sure that you know, and more information we can always give because this is really a snapshot. It doesn't cover everything. Second is the pest control companies. So they are requiring that there must be a third-party pest control operator, not the internal person doing the pest control service if you are supplying to that customer. Traceability exercise. Normally regulation allows the traceability or mock recall exercise to be recovering the product or testing the product. You can recover back in the supply chain within, like you can identify the product within 4 hours. But this particular customer is requiring within 2 hours. So now we have to be effectively better in the traceability exercise if we are supplying to this customer. Environmental monitoring. Environmental monitoring is the biggest concern, the losing the chain of custody of the product while the facility is doing a test. So it is required that food contact surface test requires to hold on any lot of the product which was made on that line since the last validated sanitation cycle, which was having a satisfactory results. So this is a snapshot, and there are more requirements of the customers. We are happy to facilitate that further if you guys are interested in that. Now let's talk about tag services. It's very important to share why we are here, because we as a tag identified the need to support exporters. We have a full-time team employed in India so that we can justify the cost of services, as well as be able to give a service which is affordable for India exporters, as well as there is a direct access of that team to Dr. David Atchison, Mr. Cameron Prince, and all other experts we have. We have a senior science officer on our team. We have other experts who are specialized in several different categories and commodities. So we wanted to assist the exporters with the proper support and services. That's why we are here to support in understanding the requirements, regulatory and customer compliance, and support in making your food safety plan, preventive control plan effectively, like written in a way that it makes sense to address the risk. Regulatory liaison, because we did had access to FDA. We had the everyone has access to FDA, but we have the ability to interact on your behalf if you need import-export assistance, import refusal assistance, and anything about crisis management happening around the retail product violation, recall, and stuff. So we can help in all. So we are here to assist.
First of all, understand what the regulatory requirements are pertaining to whatever it is you're trying to export. If it's seafood, it's one set of requirements, seafood HACCP in the US. If it's spices, it's Food Safety Modernization. So understand the regulatory requirements. Number two, make sure that you are compliant with those requirements. Number three, make sure your records are current. That essentially the records that you can show to verify that you're meeting those requirements are solid. Fourthly, make sure that the labeling is accurate on the product. And fifthly, know how to react if something goes wrong. That's what I'd put. So part of it is preparatory and part of it is reactive. That's my quick top 5.
Problems can be solved. We help companies, and inevitably, with a lot of hard work, sometimes we're able to solve problems, and the companies are able to find solutions. So it can be frustrating at times, but there are answers, and there is a way forward in almost all of these situations.
We can definitely provide guidance that we need a little bit more information about their product and their nature of the procurement and all the steps that they are planning to do in order to import. So please feel free to reach us at info@atchisongroup.com, and we will be happy to take a first call and understand your needs, and then we can facilitate.
Filth is a generic term, and essentially it includes, if you try to look at the FDA definition of filth, it's contaminants like hairs from rodents, rats, mice, excreta from rodents, insects, insect parts, extraneous materials, rocks, stones, dirt, wood, all of which are indicative of product being made in an environment that is not well controlled. It's all the little things that you find in food that would indicate that the production environment isn't protected. Heavy focus on foreign materials and rodents, for example.
The most important question really isn't about ASSEP certification or GFSI certification, is that you're required to meet the standards in the country you're exporting to. So you have to know those. Essentially, you have to have a program equivalent to the FSMA in the United States with State Food for Canadians regs. So you need to study up on those standards and do your best to emulate and use those to the extent you can.
If you are exporting an FDA-regulated product, such as spices, turmeric, ginger, or something like that, then the FDA requires you to have somebody who's trained in the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is called a Preventive Controls Qualified Individual, otherwise known as PCQI. And if you're exporting food that you made, then the expectation is that you have somebody who is a PCQI trained person who is overseeing that and is signing off on your food safety plan. We offer PCQI training if you don't have it, but that's an example where essentially being HACCP certified doesn't do you any good. It's very specific. You need PCQI training for food exported to the US under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Again, understanding those specific requirements is kind of step one, and then we can likely help you navigate to get to that point.
Labels for the US acceptable in Canada, and the short answer to that is no. The label requirements are very similar in Canada and the US, so most of a US label can be used in Canada, but, and this is a very important but, the nutrition facts table is a mandatory thing that has to be followed exactly, and the nutrition facts table is different from Canada and the US, slightly different. I mean, if you took a quick glance at it, you'd think it's the same. So that's really important. There's differences in how lists of ingredients are declared. And of course, Canada is a bilingual country, so French is mandatory on the label and it's not mandatory in the US. So those are a couple of immediate things that come to mind that mean that you do have to develop a specific label for the Canadian market.
The details between the two countries are quite specific and are quite different. The approach is the same, but the details are different. So depending on the product and the country, I'd certainly recommend that you just, feel free to talk to us about, here's what I'm proposing to do, am I on target in terms of the appropriate regulatory requirements, and am I following the rules properly? But, labels are a good example of, they're very similar, but there's enough differences that if you export a product to Canada with a US label, you'll run into problems, and vice versa. There may have been a bit more components to that question, Lisa, and I'm not sure I covered it all, the remaining parts.
I think one of the other component could be that if they are approved with FDA, then can they supply to the same certificate, same license to CFIA to Canada? So that's what I think I understand. That is a component. Cam?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I missed that part of it. Well, there are two different processes in Canada and the U.S. In the U.S., you have to be registered. There's no cost for that with the FDA. So if you're going to trade product or have product in commerce in the United States, you have to register with FDA. That's very easy to do. It's an online thing, and as I said, it doesn't cost anything. It's a different situation in Canada in that I mentioned licensing, and this is a relatively new requirement. It's only the last 3 or 4 years. So you can't export or import to Canada, and exporters can't export to Canada unless there is a company or a responsible party that holds a CFIA import license. So that is those licenses cost $250, and they can be applied for online. That's all simple, but the important thing around that is that means that importer is saying that the food is safe, that they're bringing into Canada, and they're responsible. So CFIA can come in and audit them. They'll ask to see all of the preventive controls. They can ask for the food safety program from the exporting company in India. So there's a lot of power there associated with that license, and licenses can be suspended. So it's very important to be proactive and follow those license requirements.
Question pop up about how Indian companies are being charged thousands of dollars for registration. You do not need to pay for registration to FDA.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. I saw that just fly by, and that's an example where you talk to us, we can help you save money. Because if you're being charged thousands to register, you don't need it. So I saw that one fly by, and I just wanted to jump on it.
CFIA registration and license is also a process you can be paying thousands for that as well. So why not talk to us?
Thank you for watching. We do hope this video was informative to you all. Please update yourself by seeking support from TAG for required documents before you plan to export to either seafood or spices either to USA or Canada. Email ID is given below. May you all get more opportunity to export seafood or spices to both USA and Canada market.